Minimum wage doesn't usually require a background check, a blood test, and a vow of absolute silence. But minimum wage doesn't usually involve scrubbing gunpowder out of Italian wool carpets either. Nuala took the job because she was desperate, burying her head in the bleach and the laundry, pretending her employer was just a wealthy businessman. It was a perfect, quiet lie. A survival tactic. Until Tuesday afternoon, when a single piece of glossy photo paper slipped from his desk, shattering the illusion forever. Porcelain requires a specific kind of pressure to clean without scratching. Nuala Turner knew this because she spent 4 hours a day kneeling on imported Italian tile, scrubbing the master bathrooms of the Callahan estate. She kept her head down, her hair tied back in a brutal knot, and her hands wrapped in thick yellow rubber gloves. The smell of industrial bleach was a permanent resident in her nasal cavity, drowning out the faint, lingering odours of cigar smoke and copper that occasionally seeped into the upper floors. Andrew Callahan owned the house. He owned a lot of things. Warehouses down by the docks, a string of cash-only laundromats, and, if the whispered rumours among the kitchen staff were true, half the local precinct. Nuala didn't care what he owned. She cared that he paid in cash, on time, every Friday afternoon, in a crisp, white envelope. She needed those envelopes. Her father's medical bills from the stroke were piling up on the kitchen counter of her cramped apartment, a towering monument to their poverty. Andrew wasn't the caricature of a mob boss you saw in movies. He didn't wear pinstripe suits or chew on fat cigars while shouting orders. He was a quiet man in his late 30s. His suits were charcoal, tailored but understated. He had the exhausted posture of a man who worked 80-hour weeks staring at spreadsheets. But there was something in his eyes, a flat, unreadable stillness that kept the staff terrified. When Andrew walked into a room, the air pressure changed. People stopped breathing. Nuala saw him mostly in the mornings. She would be polishing the mahogany banister. He would be coming down the stairs, tying his watch to his wrist. "Morning, Nuala," he would say. His voice was a low rumble, gravel grinding under a heavy tire. "Good morning, Mr. Callahan." That was the extent of their relationship for the first 6 months. She was part of the furniture, a ghost with a feather duster. It was exactly how she wanted it. Invisibility was safety. If he didn't notice her, he couldn't fire her. If he didn't notice her, he wouldn't drag her into whatever dark, ugly business funded the silk sheets she changed twice a week. Then came the Tuesday in November. It was raining. The kind of relentless, miserable rain that turned the city into a grey blur. Nuala was in the kitchen, wiping down the marble countertops. The house was supposed to be empty. Andrew had a meeting in the city. The other staff had retreated to their quarters. The heavy oak front door slammed shut, the sound echoing through the cavernous foyer like a gunshot. Nuala froze, the damp cloth clutched in her hand. Heavy footsteps moved down the hallway. Not the measured, calm pace Andrew usually kept. These were erratic, rushed. Andrew entered the kitchen. He was soaked. His expensive charcoal coat was heavy with water, dripping onto the pristine hardwood floor. But it wasn't just water. A dark, jagged tear ripped through the fabric near his left shoulder, and the fabric around it was stained a deep, sticky crimson. He didn't look at her. He walked straight to the sink, bracing his good hand against the edge. He breathed in ragged, shallow gasps. Nuala stood by the refrigerator, perfectly still. Her instinct screamed at her to run, to slip out the back door and catch the bus back to her safe, crumbling apartment. You don't ask questions. You don't see anything. That was the rule. Andrew turned his head. His face was pale, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. He saw her. The stillness in his eyes fractured for a fraction of a second, revealing a flash of raw, animal pain. Towels, he grunted. Nuala moved. She abandoned the cloth and went to the linen drawer, pulling out 3 clean white dish towels. She approached him slowly, as if approaching a stray dog that might bite. She held them out. He took them, pressing the wad of fabric against his shoulder. He hissed through his teeth. "You didn't see me come in," Andrew said. He wasn't looking at her anymore. He was staring out the window at the rain. "I've been cleaning the pantry for the last hour, Mr. Callahan," Nuala said evenly. Her voice didn't shake. She was surprised by that. Andrew glanced at her, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time. He noticed the steady way she held her ground. He noticed she wasn't crying or screaming. "There's a medical kit in the bottom drawer of my desk in the study," he said, his voice tightening with pain. "Bring it to my bathroom. Tell no one." Nuala nodded. She walked out of the kitchen, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She went to the study, retrieved the heavy black box from the drawer, and carried it upstairs. When she reached his bathroom, Andrew had shed his ruined coat and shirt. He was sitting on the edge of the large porcelain tub. The wound wasn't deep, a graze, really, but it was bleeding heavily. A jagged trench cut across the muscle of his upper arm. He motioned for the box. Nuala set it on the counter and stepped back. "I need you to clean it," he said. "I'm a maid, Mr. Callahan, not a nurse." "I don't have a nurse," he replied. "And I pay you enough to follow instructions. Bottle of saline, gauze, tape." Nuala washed her hands thoroughly with antibacterial soap. She put on a fresh pair of nitrile gloves from her pocket. She stepped up to him. He smelled of rain, sweat, and the sharp tang of copper. She poured the saline over the wound. Andrew's jaw locked. The muscles in his neck strained, but he didn't make a sound. Nuala worked quickly, efficiently. She wiped away the blood, applied the antiseptic dressing, and taped it down tightly. She kept her eyes focused entirely on the torn flesh, refusing to look at his face, refusing to acknowledge the intimacy of the moment. "Done," she said, stepping back and peeling off the gloves. Andrew looked at his arm, then at her. "You have a steady hand." "I clean grout for a living. You need a steady hand." A faint, humorless smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Go home, Nuala. Take tomorrow off, paid." "Yes, Mr. Callahan." She gathered the bloody towels, threw them in a trash bag, and left. She didn't look back. But as she sat on the bus ride home, staring out at the rain-streaked window, she realized the invisible wall between them had cracked. She had touched the reality of his world, and worse, he knew she could handle it. Winter settled over the city, bitter and unyielding. The temperature plummeted, freezing the slush on the sidewalks into treacherous sheets of grey ice. Inside the Callahan estate, the atmosphere was equally frigid. Ever since the afternoon in the bathroom, things had shifted. Subtly, but Nuala felt it. Andrew didn't look right through her anymore. When she served him black coffee in the mornings, his eyes tracked her movements. He started asking small questions. How is the commute in this weather? Did the new vacuum bags arrive? Nuala answered with polite, monosyllabic responses. She wanted the wall back. She needed the wall. Complicating matters was the frequent presence of Declan Hayes. Declan was Andrew's second-in-command, though he carried himself like he owned the place. Where Andrew was restrained, Declan was volatile. He was a broad-shouldered man with a neatly trimmed beard and a penchant for wearing too much expensive cologne, a cloying mix of sandalwood and citrus that lingered in a room long after he left. Declan made Nuala nervous. He didn't ignore the staff. He watched them. He had a habit of leaning against door frames while Nuala dusted, his eyes lazily following her as she stretched to reach the high shelves. "You missed a spot, sweetheart," he told her, one Thursday afternoon in the library. Nuala paused, her duster hovering over a leather-bound encyclopedia. She didn't turn around. "Which spot, Mr. Hayes?" "Right there." He walked up behind her. She could feel the heat radiating from him, smell the overwhelming cologne. He tapped a finger on the wood paneling, inches from her hand. "Gotta be thorough. Andrew hates sloppy work. He hates sloppy people even more." "I'll go over it again," Nuala said, stepping away quickly to put space between them. Declan chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "You're a quiet one. I like quiet. Quiet girls survive longer." He walked out, leaving Nuala with a cold knot tightening in her stomach. The tension between Andrew and Declan was becoming impossible to ignore. It bled through the walls of the study during their closed-door meetings. Nuala would be in the hallway, polishing the brass fixtures, and she would hear the low, dangerous rumble of their voices. "And losing territory, Andrew," Declan's voice leaked through the heavy oak door one evening. "They're pushing into the south side. You're letting them walk all over us because you're too busy playing the cautious businessman." "I am playing the long game, Declan." Andrew's voice was quieter, but carried a razor-sharp edge. "Violence draws the feds. I pay off the right people to keep the streets quiet. You start a war, you break the machine." "The machine is rusting," Declan snapped. "The men are getting restless. They want a leader who actually leads, not a fucking accountant." A heavy silence followed. Then the sound of glass shattering against a wall. "Don't ever mistake my patience for weakness, Declan," Andrew said. The absolute deadness in his tone made the hair on Nuala's arms stand up. "You leave the south side alone. That's an order. Are we clear?" Footsteps approached the door. Nuala quickly scrambled down the hall, plunging her sponge into a bucket of soapy water and scrubbing the baseboards as if her life depended on it. The door yanked open. Declan stormed out, his face flushed dark red, a vein throbbing at his temple. He didn't even look at Nuala as he marched toward the front entrance, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the chandelier. 10 minutes later, Nuala knocked softly on the study door. "What?" Andrew's voice was exhausted. She pushed the door open, carrying a small dustpan and a broom. The room smelled of expensive scotch. Andrew was sitting in his leather armchair by the window, staring out into the dark yard. A crystal tumbler lay in jagged pieces against the far wall, a dark amber stain dripping down the expensive wallpaper. Nuala didn't say a word. She walked over to the wall, knelt, and began sweeping the shards of glass into the pan. The crunching sound seemed deafening in the quiet room. "Leave it, Nuala," Andrew said quietly. "It will stain the wood floor if I don't get the liquid up, Mr. Callahan." Andrew sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He watched her work. "Do you ever get tired of cleaning up other people's messes?" Nuala paused. It was a loaded question, too personal. She kept her eyes on the glass. "It pays the rent." "Is that all it is?" Andrew stood up, walking slowly toward his desk. "Just the rent?" Nuala swept the last piece of crystal into the pan. She stood up, holding it against her side. "And medical bills. My father had a stroke 2 years ago. Requires full-time care. A nurse comes to the apartment while I'm here." Andrew leaned against the edge of his mahogany desk, crossing his arms. He looked at her, dissecting her expression. "That's a heavy burden for someone your age." "It's just life, Mr. Callahan. We all have debts to pay." A shadow crossed Andrew's face. "Yes, we do." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick money clip. He peeled off $500 bills and held them out. "For the extra trouble tonight." Nuala looked at the cash. Her stomach twisted. She desperately needed it. The pharmacy had just called about her father's blood thinners, but taking a tip for cleaning up his violent outburst felt like stepping over a line. It felt like hush money. "My salary is sufficient, Mr. Callahan." Andrew didn't pull his hand back. "Take the money, Nuala. Pride won't pay the pharmacy." She flinched internally. He saw too much. She stepped forward, took the bills, and shoved them into her apron pocket. "Thank you." "Lock the doors on your way out," Andrew said, turning his back to her and staring out the window again. "And Nuala." She stopped at the threshold. "Yes?" "Stay out of Declan's way. He's frustrated. I don't want you getting caught in the crossfire." Nuala nodded, though he couldn't see her. "Good night, Mr. Callahan." She left the room, her chest tight. The facade was crumbling rapidly. The polished floors and expensive rugs couldn't hide the rot underneath anymore. She was standing in the middle of a war zone, holding a feather duster. February brought a deceptive quiet. Declan was sent out of state to deal with a supply chain issue, Andrew's polite way of banishing him to cool off. The house breathed a sigh of relief. The staff relaxed. Andrew seemed less tense, spending hours in his study reading rather than pacing. Nuala fell back into her rhythm, the predictable, soothing mechanics of cleaning. Spray, wipe, polish, dust, vacuum, mop. Control the environment, control the chaos. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Andrew was at a sit-down with city officials downtown. Nuala was doing a deep clean of the master suite. It involved moving heavy furniture, wiping down the wainscoting, and vacuuming the intricate patterns of the Persian rugs. She finished the bedroom and moved into Andrew's private adjoining office, a smaller, more intimate space than the grand study downstairs. It held a vintage roll-top desk, a leather reading chair, and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Nuala was dusting the top shelves. She had a small step-ladder positioned near the corner. She wiped down a row of thick, leather-bound classics that looked like they had never been opened. As she shifted her weight to reach the corner, her elbow bumped a heavy brass bookend shaped like a rearing horse. The bookend slid, knocking into a row of smaller books. One of them, a hollowed-out dummy book, she realized a second too late, tipped over and fell. It hit the floor with a hollow smack. The fake cover popped open. Nuala gasped, scrambling down the ladder. "Shit!" She knelt on the rug, reaching for the box. Her only thought was putting it back exactly as it was before Andrew noticed. She scooped up the fake book. It had held a small stack of papers and a single, heavy metal key. As she gathered the spilled papers to shove them back inside, her hand stopped. It was a photograph. A glossy, 8x10 print, lying face up on the intricate red and blue patterns of the rug. Nuala stared at it. The air in her lungs simply vanished. It was a picture of her. She was standing on the corner of 4th and Elm, near her apartment building. She was wearing her old, frayed green winter coat, the one she had thrown away last spring because the zipper finally broke. She was holding a plastic grocery bag, looking down at the sidewalk. It was taken from a distance, probably from a parked car across the street. A long lens. Her hands began to shake. A cold sweat broke out across the back of her neck. Why did Andrew Callahan have a surveillance photo of her? She picked it up with trembling, gloved fingers. The edges were slightly worn, as if it had been handled frequently. She flipped it over. On the back, written in black ink in a sharp, slanted handwriting she recognized from Andrew's grocery lists and notes to the staff, were 3 lines. Nuala Turner. Debt secured. Leverage. Nuala sat back on her heels, her mind spinning wildly, trying to find traction on a suddenly frictionless surface. Debt secured. Her father's debt. Before the stroke, Her father had a gambling problem. He owed money, a lot of money, to some very bad people. When the stroke hit, the bookies suddenly vanished. The threats stopped. Nuala had foolishly, desperately assumed that the men had taken pity on a crippled old man, or that they figured they couldn't squeeze blood from a stone. She had spent the last 2 years thinking they were safe from that past. Leverage. Andrew hadn't hired her because she had good references. He hadn't bought her father's debt out of the goodness of his heart. He bought the debt to own her, or to use her. But for what? She was a nobody, a maid. What leverage could she possibly provide to a man who controlled half the city? A sickening wave of nausea washed over her. Every interaction she'd had with Andrew replayed in her head, twisted and distorted by this new lens. The quiet mornings, the extra $500, the warning to stay away from Declan. It wasn't kindness, it was a man protecting an asset. She looked at the date stamped faintly on the bottom edge of the photo. October 14th, 2 years ago, 2 months before her father's stroke. 1 month before she mysteriously saw an ad for a high-paying domestic job in a private newspaper circulation she normally never read. It was all a setup. The entire architecture of her survival for the last 2 years was a cage Andrew had carefully built around her. She had to leave. Now. Nuala shoved the papers and the key back into the hollow book, leaving the photo out. No, she couldn't leave the photo. If he knew she knew, he would find her. She shoved the photo back into the book, snapped it shut, and placed it exactly where it belonged on the top shelf, wedged tightly against the brass horse. She climbed down the ladder, her legs feeling like wet sand. She grabbed her cleaning caddy and practically ran out of the office, down the grand staircase, and into the kitchen. She ripped off her yellow gloves, throwing them into the trash. She needed to pack a bag. She needed to get her father out of the apartment. Where could they go? She had $2,000 saved. It wasn't enough to disappear. Not from Andrew Callahan. The sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway outside froze her in place. Through the kitchen window, she saw the sleek black town car pull up to the front steps. It was 2 hours early. Andrew stepped out. He was alone today, moving with a stiff, agitated energy. Nuala backed away from the window. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at her throat. She couldn't face him. If she looked at him, he would know. He saw everything. The heavy front door opened and closed. "Nuala!" His voice boomed through the foyer. It wasn't his usual calm, low register. It was urgent, tight. She stood in the kitchen, paralyzed. "Nuala, get out here!" She forced her feet to move. She smoothed down the front of her apron, trying to control her ragged breathing. She walked through the swinging door into the grand foyer. Andrew was standing by the mahogany console table. He had his coat off, thrown carelessly over a chair. He was loading a silver handgun. He slammed the magazine into the grip with a harsh, metallic clack. He looked up, his eyes locking onto hers. The flat, unreadable stillness was gone. In its place was a burning, calculated panic. "Grab your coat," Andrew said, racking the slide of the gun. "Declan just made his move. The house isn't safe. We have 3 minutes before they breach the gate." Nuala stared at the gun, then up at the man who secretly owned her life. "I'm not going anywhere with you," she whispered, her voice trembling but defiant. Andrew froze, his eyes narrowing. He took a step toward her. "This isn't a negotiation, Nuala. If you stay here, they will kill you just to hurt me. Move!" "Why?" she yelled, the fear finally breaking into anger. "Because I'm your leverage." The color drained from Andrew's face. The silence in the massive foyer suddenly felt suffocating, heavy like wet wool. The distant sound of an engine revving aggressively echoed from the bottom of the long driveway. Andrew looked at the gun in his hand, then back to Nuala, a muscle ticking in his jaw. "You went into the dummy book," he said quietly. "Who do you owe, Andrew?" she demanded, stepping backward towards the kitchen door. "What do you need me for?" A loud crash shattered the tense air. The sound of a heavy vehicle smashing through the wrought iron security gates at the end of the property. Alarms immediately began to scream, a shrill, deafening siren that bathed the foyer in pulsing red light from the security panels. "I don't owe anyone," Andrew said, lunging forward and grabbing her wrist with a grip like iron. "Your father owed Declan. I bought the debt to keep him from selling you to clear it. Now walk, or we both die right here." Before Nuala could process the words, the massive oak front door exploded inward in a shower of splinters and lead. Splinters of ancient oak erupted into the air, raining down on the marble tiles like jagged wooden teeth. The noise was absolute and consuming. It wasn't the muffled, cinematic pop of handguns. It was a deafening, concussive roar of automatic weapons that sucked the oxygen entirely out of the foyer. Andrew hit her low, tackling her behind the thick stone base of the grand staircase. Nuala slammed onto the hard floor. The wind knocked from her lungs in a sharp, painful gasp. Her forehead cracked against the baseboard, and a high-pitched ringing immediately hijacked her ears. "Keep your head down," Andrew roared, though his voice sounded miles away through the ringing. He didn't wait for a response. He leaned out from their cover, the silver handgun barking 3 times in rapid succession. A heavy thud echoed from the front door, followed by a wet, gargling scream. Nuala curled into a tight ball, her hands clamped over her ears. The pristine world she had spent the last 2 years polishing was being shredded to pieces. Expensive plaster rained down on her shoulders. The antique mirror above the console table exploded, showering them with razor-sharp glass. "Up!" Andrew commanded, grabbing the back of her apron and hauling her to her feet. "We move to the kitchen, now." He shoved her forward. Nuala stumbled, her rubber-soled work shoes slipping on the glass-littered marble. She caught her balance, adrenaline flooding her veins with a toxic electric heat. She ran. She shoved through the heavy swinging door into the kitchen, Andrew right on her heels. Gunfire tore through the walls behind them, tearing apart the drywall and blowing out the glass fronts of the custom cabinetry. Expensive porcelain plates shattered into dust. "The pantry," Andrew said, shoving a heavy oak island cart into the doorway to buy them 3 seconds of cover. Nuala scrambled toward the walk-in pantry, her chest heaving. Andrew pushed past her, ignoring the shelves of imported olive oil and dried pasta. He dropped to his knees at the very back, feeling along the edge of the bottom shelf. He pressed a recessed button. With a heavy pneumatic hiss, the entire shelving unit swung outward on a hidden steel hinge. A dark, narrow staircase plunged into the earth. "Go!" he barked, checking his weapon's magazine. Nuala didn't hesitate. Survival instinct overrode her fury. She plunged into the darkness, her hands trailing along the rough concrete walls to keep from falling. Andrew followed, pulling the heavy shelf shut behind them. The mechanical latch clicked into place, instantly muffling the chaos above into a distant, thumping bass. Emergency LED strips flickered to life, casting a sickly yellow glow over the concrete steps. Andrew pushed past her, taking the lead. His charcoal shirt was covered in white plaster, his face tight with a terrifying focus. "Keep moving," he said, not looking back. "It's a 1/4-mile tunnel. Exits in the drainage culvert beyond the property line." Nuala followed his broad shoulders, her breath echoing loudly in the narrow space. Her mind was a chaotic mess. desperately trying to assemble the puzzle pieces he had just thrown at her. "Your father owed Declan. I bought the debt to keep him from selling you." "You're lying," she gasped out, the words echoing off the concrete. Andrew didn't slow down. "I don't have the luxury of lying right now, Nuala. My father owed bookies, faceless men in the heights." "Your father owed a loan shark named Mickey Russo," Andrew corrected, his voice echoing back to her, cold and factual. "Russo kicked his tribute up to Declan. When your father stroked out, the debt hit 60,000. Russo was going to collect by putting you in a shipping container bound for a private club in Macau. Declan signed off on it. It's how he handles bad paper." Nuala's stomach hollowed out. A wave of profound, debilitating nausea hit her. She stumbled, grabbing the damp wall to steady herself. The air in the tunnel suddenly felt too thick to breathe. Macau, a shipping container. The reality of how close she had come to vanishing entirely pressed down on her chest like an anvil. "Why would you care?" she demanded to his back. "You're a monster too." Andrew finally stopped. He turned around, the yellow light casting hollow shadows under his eyes. "Because Declan runs his side businesses like a butcher. I wanted his human trafficking lines shut down. Buying your father's paper was a quiet way to pull a thread in his operation without starting a war. So I was just a pawn, a bookkeeping error to exploit. Initially," Andrew said softly. The absolute lack of emotion in his voice was terrifying. "But then I needed to keep you where I could see you. If Declan realized I bought the debt, he would have killed you just to prove a point. So I gave you a mop and told you to keep your head down." He turned back around and kept walking. Nuala stared at his back, a bitter, acidic taste flooding her mouth. He had saved her life. He had systematically trapped her in his house, making her scrub his toilets to protect her from his own second-in-command. It was a twisted, sick kind of mercy, and she hated him for it. But as they reached the heavy iron grate at the end of the tunnel, she realized one terrifying truth. He was the only thing standing between her and a fate worse than death. Rain battered the tin roof of the abandoned auto body shop like a swarm of angry locusts. The structure sat on the industrial edge of the city, surrounded by rusting husks of stripped cars and overgrown weeds. It smelled of motor oil, damp earth and ozone. Andrew had kicked open a side door, leading her into an empty office attached to the main garage. The room contained a metal desk, 2 folding chairs, and a thick layer of grime on the windows. He locked the deadbolt, pulled the heavy metal blinds shut, and finally holstered his weapon. He leaned heavily against the edge of the desk, dropping his head. He looked exhausted. The polished, terrifying mob boss from the morning was gone, replaced by a ragged man running out of time. Nuala stood in the center of the room, shivering. Her thin apron was soaked from the dash through the rain, clinging to her jeans. "My father," she said, her voice cracking for the first time. "If Declan is taking over, if he knows about me, he'll go to the apartment. My dad can't even walk." Andrew reached into his pocket and pulled out a burner phone. "He's not at the apartment." Nuala's head snapped up. "What did you do?" "When Declan missed his check-in this morning, I knew it was a coup," Andrew said, typing a short sequence into the phone. "I sent 2 of my most trusted guys to your place. They packed up your father and his nurse an hour ago. They're on the road to a safe house upstate." He hit dial, put the phone on speaker, and set it on the metal desk. It rang twice. "Boss," a gruff voice answered over the static. "Status, Miller. Package is secured. Vitals are stable. The nurse is panicked but cooperating. We're past the tollways. Nobody on our tail." Andrew looked up at Nuala. "Put the old man on." A rustling sound came through the tiny speaker, followed by the heavy, slurred breathing Nuala recognized instantly. "Dad?" she choked out, stepping closer to the desk. "Nuala." The voice was weak, the syllables thick and clumsy from the stroke. Men came, taking me. Tears, hot and furious, spilled over her lower lashes. "I know, Dad. I know. Just go with them. Do what the nurse says. I'll meet you soon, okay? I promise." "Okay, baby girl." Andrew reached forward and ended the call. The silence rushed back into the room, heavy and oppressive. Nuala wiped her face with the back of her dirty, bruised hand. She stared at Andrew. He had thought of everything, every variable, every angle. He had orchestrated her safety before she even knew she was in danger. "Thank you," she said, the words tasting like ash. "Don't thank me yet," Andrew replied, rubbing the back of his neck. He winced, his hand brushing the spot where the bullet had grazed his shoulder months ago. "Declan holds the city now. He has the numbers. I have a few loyalists, but by morning there will be a bounty on my head so large my own shadow will try to collect it. And on mine. Yes." Andrew looked at her, his eyes stripping away the maid's uniform, the grime, the tears. He looked at her the way a general looks at a map. "He knows I care about you. That makes you a liability to him, and a weapon against me." Nuala flinched at the word care. "You don't care about me. You care about your leverage, your little pet project. You saved me so you could feel like a god." Andrew pushed off the desk. He took 2 slow steps toward her. In the cramped, dimly lit office, his physical presence was overwhelming. He stopped just inches away, close enough that she could smell the rain on his skin and the faint, bitter scent of gunpowder. "Do you really think I let you clean my private office for 2 years just to play a game?" he asked, his voice dropping to a low, rough whisper. "Do you think I paid you 5 times the going rate because I wanted a clean floor?" Nuala swallowed hard, refusing to step back. She tilted her chin up, meeting his dead-eyed stare. "Then why, Andrew?" He reached out slowly. She braced herself to be grabbed, to be shoved, but his hand stopped in the air. His knuckles lightly grazed the side of her cheek, brushing away a streak of dirt and plaster dust. His touch was shockingly warm, because in a world full of liars, thieves and butchers, he murmured, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "You were the only real thing in that house. You kept your head down, you paid your debts, and you never once asked me for a favor. I watched you break your back every single day for an old man who ruined your life, and you never complained." He dropped his hand, taking a half step back, though his eyes never left hers. "I bought your paper to spite Declan," Andrew admitted, the confession costing him visible effort. "But I kept you there because I was selfish, because walking past you in the hallway was the only 5 seconds of my day where I didn't feel like a monster." Nuala's breath hitched. The cynical, defensive shell she had worn for years cracked straight down the middle. She wanted to yell at him. She wanted to hit him. But the sheer, exhausting honesty in his voice completely disarmed her. He wasn't playing a game anymore. The board had been flipped over. "So what now?" she asked, her voice shaking. "We hide in a garage until he finds us?" "No," Andrew said, the hardness returning to his jaw. He walked over to a metal filing cabinet in the corner, unlocked it with a key from his pocket, and pulled out a heavy black duffel bag. He unzipped it and tossed it onto the desk. Stacks of bundled cash, passports, and a heavy ledger bound in cracked red leather spilled out. "We don't hide," Andrew said, picking up the red book. "Declan wants the throne, but he doesn't know how to run the accounts. This ledger holds the routing numbers for offshore accounts containing $40 million. It holds the names of every corrupt judge and dirty cop in the state. He looked at her, the calculating mob boss fully resurrected. He needs this book to survive the transition, Andrew said flatly. And we are going to use it to rip his throat out. $40 million. Nuala repeated the number in her head, letting the sheer, crushing weight of it settle into her bones. She stared at the cracked red leather binding of the book resting on the greasy metal desk. It didn't look like an empire. It looked like a cheap diary you could buy at a corner pharmacy. Andrew didn't give her time to process the magnitude of the object. He picked up the burner phone, dialing a number from memory. He held it to his ear, his eyes scanning the dark, rain-streaked windows of the garage. "Sullivan," Andrew said when the line clicked open. His voice was perfectly level, devoid of the exhaustion that had plagued him 5 minutes ago. "I need a sit-down. Tonight. Tell Declan if he wants the routing codes, he meets me at the Starlight Diner on Route 9. 2 hours. He comes alone, or I burn the book and he can explain to the cartel why their money vanished." Andrew hung up before the man on the other end could reply. He crushed the cheap plastic phone in his fist, dropping the cracked pieces into a nearby trash can. "Who is Sullivan?" Nuala asked, wrapping her arms around her wet torso. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by a deep, shivering chill. "A neutral broker," Andrew replied, pulling a heavy canvas jacket from the back of the filing cabinet and tossing it to her. "He mediates disputes. Declan will listen to him because Sullivan controls the port unions. If Declan wants to move product, he has to play by Sullivan's rules for now." Nuala caught the jacket. It was huge, smelling faintly of motor oil, but the canvas was lined with thick fleece. She put it on, shivering as the warmth hit her damp skin. "And you think Declan will actually come alone?" "Not a chance in hell," Andrew said, ejecting the magazine from his silver handgun, checking the brass rounds, and slapping it back into the grip. "He'll bring half the city's muscle and surround the diner, but he'll walk through the front door by himself. His ego won't let him do anything less." Nuala zipped the jacket up to her chin. She looked at the gun in Andrew's hand, then at the duffel bag full of cash. A terrifying alien clarity began to crystallize in her mind. For 2 years, she had survived by being invisible. She had scrubbed toilets, avoided eye contact, and let powerful men dictate her existence. That strategy had ended the moment Andrew's front door exploded. "Give me a gun," she said. Andrew paused, the slide of his weapon halfway pulled back. He looked at her, his dark eyes narrowing. "No." "If he doesn't come alone, you're walking into a firing squad," Nuala argued, her voice surprisingly steady. "If you die in that diner, Declan finds me. He finds my father. I am not waiting in a car for you to handle this." "You don't know how to shoot, Nuala. You'll hesitate, and hesitation gets people killed." "I know how to point and pull a trigger," she fired back, stepping toward him. "You said I was a weapon against you. Let me be a weapon for you. I earned my place in this mess the second you used my father's life as a poker chip." Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. The rain drummed relentlessly against the tin roof above. Andrew stared down at her. He saw the tremble in her hands, but he also saw the absolute, unyielding iron in her posture. She wasn't playing the victim anymore. She was demanding a seat at the table. With a tight exhale, Andrew reached behind his back, unclipping a small, matte black Glock 43 from a hidden holster inside his waistband. He checked the chamber, ensuring a round was seated, and engaged the safety. He held it out to her, grip first. Nuala took it. The metal was heavy, cold, and profoundly unnatural in her palm. "The safety is here," Andrew instructed, his fingers brushing hers as he pointed to the small lever. "Push it down to fire. Keep your finger off the trigger until you are ready to destroy whatever is in front of you. Recoil will push the barrel up, so aim lower than you think you need to. Center mass. Nuala nodded, wrapping her fingers around the grip exactly as he showed her. Center mass. You stay by my side, Andrew said, his voice dropping to a low, rough rumble. You don't speak. You don't negotiate. If the shooting starts, you drop to the floor and you shoot anything that doesn't look like me. Do you understand? Yes. He reached out, his hand wrapping around the back of her neck. His thumb brushed the angry red bruise forming near her hairline from where she had hit the stairs. The touch was grounding, pulling her back from the edge of panic. We walk out of that diner together, Nuala, he said quietly. That's a promise. She looked up into his flat, unreadable eyes. For the first time since she met him, she believed him. Neon pink and harsh blue light bled through the torrential downpour, casting long, warped shadows across the flooded parking lot of the Starlight Diner. The place had been closed for hours. A faded, closed sign hung crookedly in the glass door. Andrew parked the stolen sedan 2 blocks away, hidden in the shadows of an abandoned strip mall. They walked the rest of the way in the freezing rain, sticking to the muddy ditch parallel to the highway. Nuala's boots were soaked through, her teeth chattering uncontrollably, but she gripped the small pistol in her pocket like a lifeline. They approached the back entrance of the diner. Andrew picked the cheap padlock on the delivery door in less than 10 seconds. They slipped inside, stepping into the dark, greasy kitchen. The smell of stale fryer oil and burnt coffee lingered heavily in the damp air. Andrew motioned for her to stay silent. He crept to the swinging metal doors that led to the dining area, peering through the small circular glass window. Nuala stood behind him, her heart hammering against her ribs with brutal, frantic thuds. She focused on her breathing, in through the nose, out through the mouth. She felt the cold steel of the Glock in her pocket. Push down to fire, aim center mass. Headlights swept across the front windows of the diner, blindingly bright. 3 black SUVs pulled into the parking lot, their tires crunching loudly over the loose gravel. The engines idled with a menacing, deep rumble. Doors slammed. Through the small window, Nuala watched as a heavy silhouette approached the front doors. The lock clicked open from the outside. Declan clearly had his own keys or had threatened the owner for them. The diner lights snapped on, violently bright fluorescent tubes flickering to life with an angry buzz. Declan Hayes stood in the center of the black and white checkered floor. He was wearing a tailored suit, entirely dry, exuding an aura of absolute, arrogant confidence. Behind him stood 4 massive men wearing heavy dark coats, their hands resting ominously inside their pockets. "Andrew!" Declan's voice echoed off the cheap vinyl booths and formica tables. "I know you're here. The broker said 2 hours. It's been 2 hours. Stop hiding." Andrew pushed the swinging door open and stepped into the dining room. Nuala followed, staying exactly 1 step behind his right shoulder. Declan smiled, a sharp, predatory baring of teeth. The smile faltered slightly when he saw Nuala, his eyes raking over her oversized canvas jacket and wet hair. "Well, well," Declan chuckled, the cloying scent of his sandalwood cologne wafting across the room despite the stale grease. "You brought the Maid. Andrew, really. You're dragging civilian collateral into a transition of power. That's sloppy, even for you." "She's not collateral," Andrew said smoothly, pulling out a chair at the nearest booth and sitting down. He didn't offer a chair to Declan. "She's the reason you aren't finding your shipping containers tomorrow." Declan's jaw tightened. "So it was you. You bought Rousseau's paper just to disrupt my lines." "I don't like human trafficking in my city, Declan. It brings the feds, and it makes us look like animals." Andrew casually tossed the cracked red ledger onto the middle of the table. It landed with a heavy thud. "But you don't care about that. You care about this." Declan's eyes locked onto the book. Hunger, raw and unvarnished, flashed across his face. He took a step toward the booth. His muscle tensed behind him. "40 million in offshore accounts," Declan murmured, stopping just short of the table. "Plus the payroll for the judges. Give it to me, Andrew. You step down, you leave the state, and I let you live. I'll even let you take the girl. A retirement gift." Andrew leaned back against the red vinyl booth, crossing his arms. "That's a generous offer, but there's a problem." "What problem?" "The routing numbers in that book require a secondary authentication code to access," Andrew said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "A rolling encrypted cipher that changes every 12 hours. Only 2 people have the algorithm, me and the banker in Geneva." Declan's smug expression shattered. He slammed his hand down on the table, rattling the salt and pepper shakers. "You're lying. You're bluffing to buy time." "Shoot me and find out," Andrew offered, spreading his hands. "Put a bullet in my head right now, take the book, and try to log in. The system locks out after 3 failed attempts. The money burns. The judges don't get paid next week. How long do you think your men will stay loyal when the paychecks bounce and the warrants start flying?" Silence crashed down over the diner, broken only by the hum of the fluorescent lights. Declan stared at Andrew, his chest heaving with sudden rage. He realized, in that split second, that he had walked straight into a trap. He had the muscle, he had the territory, but Andrew held the leash. "What do you want?" Declan hissed, his hand hovering over the inside of his jacket. "I want you out of my city," Andrew stated. "You take your 4 men here, you get in those SUVs, and you drive south. You never cross state lines again. Every 12 hours, I will text you the cipher to withdraw $50,000. That's your allowance. You try to come back, or you try to kill me, the texts stop. You starve." Declan let out a harsh, barking laugh. "You want to put me on an allowance, you arrogant son of a bitch." He signaled with his hand. The 4 men behind him drew their weapons, aiming directly at Andrew and Nuala. Nuala's hand slipped into her pocket, her thumb finding the safety switch of the Glock. She pushed it down. Her heart slammed against her ribs, but her hand was perfectly still. "You think you hold all the cards?" Declan sneered, pulling his own weapon and pointing it squarely at Andrew's chest. "I don't need the 40 million. I have the streets. I'll build my own wealth. And I'll start by putting you both in the ground." Andrew didn't blink. He didn't even reach for his gun. He just looked past Declan, toward the dark, rain-slicked windows at the front of the diner. "You should really check your blind spots, Declan," Andrew said quietly. A sharp, deafening crack echoed through the diner. The glass of the front window exploded inward. The massive man standing to Declan's immediate left crumpled to the floor instantly. A neat hole punched through his temple. Chaos erupted. Glass showered the checkered floor like a sudden, violent rain of diamonds, instantly followed by the deafening roar of return fire. Andrew kicked the heavy diner table upward, the thick laminate top acting as a crude shield, just as a barrage of bullets chewed into the booth's red vinyl seating. Nuala hit the floor hard. Her elbows slammed into the greasy tiles, sending a shockwave of pain up her arms. Panic threatened to paralyze her, a high-pitched ringing echoing in her ears, but survival instinct was louder. She drew the Glock from her pocket, her thumb already verifying the safety was pressed down. Declan screamed, not in pain, but in pure, unhinged fury. "Kill him! Rip him apart!" Andrew was a machine. He leaned around the edge of the overturned table, firing twice with terrifying precision. Another of Declan's men collapsed backward over a row of spinning diner stools, clutching his chest, his weapon clattering harmlessly to the ground. That left two standing, plus Declan. One of the men, a massive brute with a shaved head, dove behind the front counter. He began crawling through the narrow gap between the kitchen swinging doors, trying to flank their position from the rear. Andrew was pinned down by Declan and the remaining guard, who were laying down heavy suppressing fire from behind a row of reinforced booths. He couldn't see the man moving through the kitchen, but Nuala could. She saw the brute's heavy boots pushing through the crack of the swinging door. She saw the glint of blued steel in his hand. If he stood up, he would have a point-blank shot at the back of Andrew's head. Push down to fire. Aim lower than you think. Center mass. Nuala pushed herself up on one knee. Her hands were shaking violently. The small gun felt impossibly heavy, slick with her own sweat. She aimed at the center of the man's broad chest as he rose from his crouch. She squeezed the trigger. The recoil snapped her wrists back with brutal force, a sharp crack of sound temporarily deafening her right ear. The brute stopped entirely. He looked down at his chest, a blossoming stain of dark crimson ruining his grey shirt. Then his eyes rolled back, and he pitched forward, crashing into a rack of metal bussing tubs with a horrific clatter. Nuala dropped the gun. It hit the tile with a heavy thud. She gasped for air, her lungs burning, staring at the body she had just dropped. She had shot a man. The pristine, invisible Maid was dead. Silence suddenly fell over the diner. The gunfire stopped abruptly. The only sound was the hiss of rain whipping through the shattered front windows and the dripping of an espresso machine someone had hit. "Hold your fire!" Andrew roared into the sudden quiet. He stepped out from behind the ruined table, his weapon locked on the booths. Declan's last remaining guard threw his gun into the aisle and bolted for the back door, choosing survival over a dead man's loyalty. Declan didn't run. He lay propped against the base of the counter, clutching his stomach. A dark pool of liquid was spreading rapidly across the checkerboard tiles beneath him. Andrew's blind fire through the booth had found its mark. Andrew walked over to him slowly, kicking Declan's discarded weapon across the room. He stood over his former second-in-command, his face an emotionless mask. "You set a sniper," Declan gasped, spitting a mouthful of copper-tasting saliva onto the floor. Sullivan betrayed me. Sullivan owes me for keeping the docks quiet for a decade," Andrew said softly. "You thought you could buy loyalty with promises of expansion. I bought it with stability. You never understood the difference." Declan let out a wet, rattling laugh, his skin turning a sickly shade of grey. "You're soft, Andrew. The cartel won't respect a man who brings his maid to a gunfight." Declan's right hand twitched. He was reaching for a small silver backup piece strapped to his ankle. Andrew didn't blink. He raised his handgun and fired once. Declan slumped backward, his eyes fixed on the flickering fluorescent lights above. The threat was permanently eliminated. Andrew lowered his gun. He turned around, his eyes sweeping the destroyed diner until they landed on Nuala. She was still kneeling on the floor, staring blankly at the man she had shot, her chest heaving in shallow, ragged gasps. Andrew holstered his weapon. He walked over to her, stepping over the debris, and knelt beside her on the broken glass. He didn't speak. He gently reached out and took her trembling, cold hands in his warm ones, grounding her in the quiet aftermath of the violence. Dawn broke grey and reluctant over the Catskill Mountains. The safe house was a modest timber cabin hidden at the end of a private dirt road, flanked by towering pines. Inside, a heavy stone fireplace crackled, fighting back the biting mountain chill. Nuala sat at the rough-hewn wooden dining table, a mug of black coffee warming her palms. In the back bedroom, her father was fast asleep, the stress of the extraction finally giving way to deep exhaustion. The nurse had set up a makeshift care station and assured them his vitals were perfectly stable. Andrew stood by the window, staring out at the heavy mist rolling through the trees. He had washed the plaster dust and grime from his face, but the exhaustion was carved deep into the lines around his eyes. The red ledger sat exactly in the center of the table, an anchor holding down the remnants of their old lives. "My men cleared the estate," Andrew said quietly, breaking the long silence. "Declan's loyalists are either scattering or begging for amnesty. The transition is over." Nuala took a sip of her coffee. The bitter liquid helped clear the lingering numbness from her mind. "So, you're the king again?" "There are no kings in this business," Andrew replied, turning to face her. "Just men waiting for the next knife in the dark." He walked over to the table and picked up the heavy black duffel bag they had brought from the garage. He unzipped it and pushed it across the wood toward her. $50,000, Andrew said, his tone entirely business. "Clean bills. There's a forged passport inside, Canadian. The name is authentic. The background holds up to standard scrutiny. It's enough to set up a new life, hire private care for your father, and disappear entirely." Nuala stared at the neatly banded stacks of cash. It was more money than she had ever seen in her life. It was freedom. It was exactly what she had prayed for during every grueling, bleach-scented shift. It was a ticket out of the nightmare. "And the debt?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Erased," Andrew stated. "The ledger is mine. Mickey Russo will never look in your direction again. You're free, Nuala." She looked up from the bag, meeting his gaze. He stood tall, distant, wrapping himself back in the cold, unreadable armor that had defined him for years. He was giving her exactly what she wanted. He was stepping aside so she could escape the monster he believed himself to be. Nuala reached out. She didn't touch the money. She pushed the heavy duffel bag back across the table. Andrew's brows knitted together in confusion. "What are you doing?" "I'm not leaving," she said simply. "Nuala, you don't understand the reality of this life. Last night was just a fraction of the violence. It never ends." "I understand exactly what it is," she interrupted, standing up from her chair. She walked around the table, stopping inches from him. "For 2 years I hid. I scrubbed your floors and pretended the world was safe as long as I didn't look at the dirt beneath the rugs. But you forced me to look. You gave me a gun, and I used it to protect you." Andrew's jaw tightened. "You shouldn't have had to do that. It was my failure to keep you out of it." "It was my choice," Nuala corrected fiercely. "Just like hiding was my choice. Just like taking the money would be my choice. But I'm done being invisible, Andrew." She reached up, her fingers resting lightly against his chest, right over his heart. She could feel the steady, powerful rhythm beating beneath the fabric of his shirt. "You said I was the only real thing in that house," she murmured, holding his gaze unflinchingly. "I'm still here. I'm real. And I'm not running away from you." Andrew stared down at her, the rigid control he fought so hard to maintain finally fracturing. The emotional distance collapsed instantly. He lifted his hands, burying his fingers in her hair, pulling her against him. He kissed her. It wasn't a gentle, polite kiss. It was desperate, bruising, born from years of quiet observation and the shared trauma of survival. Nuala kissed him back, anchoring her hands into his shirt. The fear and anger of the past 24 hours dissolved, replaced by a fierce, undeniable heat. They were two damaged people, bound together by a dirty ledger and a desperate need for something authentic in a world built entirely on lies. When Andrew finally pulled away, he rested his forehead against hers, his breathing ragged. "If you stay," he whispered, his voice gravel rough, "there is no walking away. You know everything. You become a target again." Nuala looked over his shoulder at the cracked red ledger sitting on the table. It didn't look like a cheap diary anymore. It looked like a foundation. "Then teach me how to read the book," she said, her voice steady and resolute. "If they come for us, we face them together." Andrew looked at her, a slow, genuine smile breaking through the shadows on his face. He kissed her forehead, wrapping his arms securely around her shoulders. "We start tomorrow," he said. "If you made it this far, you know Nuala and Andrew are just getting started. The truth is out, but the danger is already knocking down the front door. Will Andrew's ruthless protection be enough to keep Nuala safe, or will Declan's violent betrayal destroy them both? What happens when a forced alliance built on secrets turns into something deeply, undeniably real? Drop a like if you want to see Nuala survive the night. Share this with someone who loves a dark, slow-burn thriller, and subscribe right now so you don't miss the next parts. The real chaos is about to begin.